3 months of war have devastated Europe, and with conflict recently spreading to colonial territory in Africa and the Far East, it grew ever larger. It would grow many times larger this week, though, and open up huge new theaters of battle as the Ottoman Empire entered the war. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week we saw the Belgians flood the fields of northern Flanders to stop the Germans. Further south on the Ypres salient, the battle raged on, with the Germans readying a new offensive, while the French began to move up to help the British. In the east, the Russians were driving back the Germans in the north and the Austrians in the south, while the Russian ports on the Black Sea had just been bombed, seemingly by the Ottoman Empire. On November 1st, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Now, the thing about Turkey is that it was seen as backwards and pretty easy pickings for the Europeans, who had found a new love for Middle Eastern oil. This was an error. Enver Pascha, the Turkish Minister of War, now practiced a French revolutionary model of nationalism, a new language, a new interpretation of history, and a wholly national future. He was willing to make large sacrifices and use almost any means to achieve his goals, and Pascha actually tricked his government into going to war. Last week, 2 German battleships were in Turkish waters, and Pascha got the crews to wear fezzes, pretend to be Turks, and bombard the Russian ports on the Black Sea, hoping the Russians would declare war on Turkey. This worked, and 3 empires were now fighting against Russia. But if you look at them, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and their respective war agitators, Helmut von Moltke, Konrad von Hotzendorf, and Pascha, nothing worked out the way they had dreamed, and millions of their countrymen died as a direct result of their actions. The first actions taken against the Turks happened immediately. The Russians sent troops into eastern Turkey in what would become the Bergman Offensive. And on November 3rd, the British and French bombed the Dardanelles, though neither Britain nor France would declare war on the Ottomans for another couple of days. One country with an historic grievance against the Ottoman Empire was Serbia, only independent since 1878, and she declared war on the Turks November 2nd. Now, Serbia was at the center of the beginning of the whole war back in July, though we hadn't heard much from her since she managed to drive the Austrian army from her land in September. But Austria-Hungary was about to try again. On November 6th, General Oskar Potiorek launched an offensive on 3 fronts with 500,000 troops against half that number of Serbs. Potiorek had failed disastrously earlier in the war, mainly through conceit and incompetence, and the confidence of his troops was low in spite of their numerical advantage, but off they went. It's really no surprise that the Austrian army was demoralized when you see what was going on the Russian front. After breaking out of the siege at the fortress of Przemyśl, the Austrians had mounted a big offensive against Russia, only to be driven back with terrible losses. In early November, they were once again pulling back from the River San to the fortress, with the Russians slowly tightening the noose. I say slowly, but that's a bit of a surprise at this point, actually. Both the Austrians and the Germans had been astonished by how well and especially how quickly the Russians had redeployed along the Vistula River the last 2 weeks of October to win the battles of Ivangorod and Warsaw. The Russian follow-up plan was pretty straightforward. Continue to drive toward Berlin with their new reinforcements from Siberia and Central Asia, and attack the Austrians further south between Krakow and Przemyśl. One problem with this attack, though, was railways. The Russians had been great at using the railways in central and southern Poland in late October, but there were few railways in western Poland. This was a deliberate defensive maneuver, but the Germans had destroyed what few there were while retreating. But in the end, it was mainly because of the unpreparedness of their rear that the Russians pursued their enemies too slowly, and as a result, the German armies managed to escape destruction, and by November 8th, the Russian advance was forced to halt, when the rear was 150 kilometers behind the front lines, which disrupted the supply of both food and ammunition. On the Western Front, there was nothing like 150 kilometers between anything. In fact, the distance between the two enemies was often less than 150 meters, and the fighting was fierce, and it would continue all week long. German Chief of Staff Falkenhayn began a new offensive along the line in Flanders. One of his main goals was Gelluveld, and on the morning of October 31st, the British were driven out of it, and there was suddenly a real threat of a German breakthrough. But amazingly, British reinforcements managed to turn the tide in the afternoon and retake the town and secure the Menin Road. By the end of the day, it was plain that the German advance had been stopped and the feared breakthrough to the sea halted. The British spent that night digging in and fighting off German attacks, and the next day, the right flank of the British lines was taken over and strengthened by French troops. By the evening of November 3rd, much of the German High Command had abandoned their hopes of a breakthrough after suffering 17,500 casualties in 3 days. Interestingly enough, there were many German officers on the Western Front who believed that now would be a good time to reverse the Schlieffen Plan and instead focus on the Eastern Front, where a decisive victory might still be possible. But the Kaiser and Falkenhayn still believed in the Western victory, and on November 6th, the Kaiser himself came to the region to encourage his troops. While there, though, he made a blunder that left a bad impression on many of his soldiers by chatting amiably in English to British prisoners of war. Although the fighting on the Ypres salient would continue to mid-November, several of the battles of the race to the sea were ending this week. Along the line, the fighting was winding down at La Bassée, Messines, and Armentières, but all of these battles, all along the line, that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of casualties, were the real end of something big. They were the final battles of maneuvering along the Western Front until 1918. One arena of battle where there would be constant maneuvering throughout the war, though, was at sea. This week, the war at sea reached South America with the Battle of Coronel off the coast of Chile. Now, early on in the war, the German East Asia Squadron under Maximilian von Spee had abandoned its base at Tsingtao once the Japanese had joined the British. Spee's ships had headed east to disrupt commercial shipping. On November 1st, Spee was engaged by a British naval squadron, despite the fact that the British were hopelessly outclassed in ships, crew, firepower, and training. He sank the ships Good Hope and Monmouth, and 1,500 British sailors drowned. Spee's casualties were just 3 men injured. However, he used half of his supply of ammunition, and this was irreplaceable. So in spite of a major victory, Spee was in a bad way. Tsingtao itself was also in a bad way. It had been under siege by the Japanese and the British for nearly 2 months, but at the end of October, the Japanese had begun shelling the city. The bombardment lasted for a week before Japanese infantry could defeat the Germans. A great side note here, Günther Pluschow, one of the most interesting characters of the whole war, as pilot of the only German plane at Tsingtao, allegedly shot down a Japanese plane with his pistol. This was the first aerial victory in aviation history. Pluschow then left the colony on the 6th, carrying documents and dispatches, but crash-landed in China. Okay? He escaped from China to the west, but was arrested by the British in Gibraltar and sent to a POW camp in Britain. After that, he became the only man in either world war to escape from Britain and make it back to Germany. True story. In Africa, this week saw the battles of Tanga and Kilimanjaro, which together were an offensive by British and Indian troops to take German East Africa. Both battles failed spectacularly, especially the larger one at Tanga, where the Germans were outnumbered as much as 8-1, but still won thanks to British incompetence and lack of training, and the brilliance of German General von Lettow-Vorbeck, who would lead the German troops in East Africa until the end of the war without ever suffering a defeat, in spite of always being outnumbered. Now, Lettow-Vorbeck was a master of guerrilla warfare and spent much of the war launching raids that tied down tens of thousands of British and colonial troops, preventing them from going to Europe to fight. So at the end of the week, the Germans are stalled in the west and the Russians in the east. The Austrians are running from the Russians but moving against the Serbs. And with the Ottoman entry into the war and battles in Africa and the Far East, the conflict becomes ever more global. Enver Pascha got what he wanted. The Ottomans were now at war. For Pascha, the aim of the war was clear. A new Turkish nation would be born from the struggle and bonded by the suffering. A nation that did not look to the Arab world for guidance, but looked to itself. But while this goal was ultimately successful, Turkey would lose a quarter of her entire population in the struggle. Millions of men, women, and children, many of them starving or freezing to death. And Enver Pascha would never be the man to lead those who lived. And a little coda here, the Western Front had been a stalemate for nearly 2 months, but before that, it was very much a war of motion. This really began to change at the Ain River and the beginnings of trench warfare. You can check that out right here if you haven't already, and click subscribe to never miss an episode.